Okay, we're back in recording.
So just briefly, we're up to about 250. Krishna has already taught in this second chapter two types of teachings: the true nature of the self, and then briefly he touched on karma yoga, how Arjuna should engage himself in the battle. What is skillfulness in action? What is equanimity of mind in action? How to make action a means to be freed from the bondage of karma. That was taught. Then he says, you will, in 53, he says, you will win this supreme yoga, that highest yoga, when your intellect, which has been bewildered by seemingly contradictory statements, at that time, you will attain establishment in the self. So he ends with that. And then in 254, because he was going to now teach him more about karma yoga, having taught him about the true nature of the self and briefly introduced karma yoga, there's much more to be taught about it. But Arjuna interjects at this point a question. So from 254 to the end of the chapter, a whole new topic arises before Krishna can get back to the teaching of karma yoga. But this is a very important section of the second chapter. So let me spend the remaining of this an introduction to the third chapter. So Arjuna, having listened to karma yoga, he should engage in the battle. But having listened to the wisdom about the self, that the self is actionless, unborn, and that's the supreme way to be freed by the knowledge of the true self, having heard that wisdom teaching, and having heard about karma yoga, he wants to know the person who has this wisdom about the nature of the self, the person who is established firmly in that wisdom, he wants to know something about that person. So he says, Stitta Prajna, that person who is established in the wisdom concerning the true nature of the self. Ka Basha, what is his description? How does he walk? How does he sit? How does he stand? He'll talk very quiet and he'll stand with his back very straight. These are the questions. Arjuna thinks that the qualities of a wise man are identifiable by how he walks, talks, or stands. And from that question, the answer to that question, what are the characteristics of a person who knows the self? From 254 to 272, the end, last shloka, is this full description. So I'll go through this so you'll just get a flavor of it. Who is this person that's established in the self? Because if we want to go to a teacher that is going to teach us about the self, they themselves should be established in it. And how can we, as ignorant people, know whether somebody, what is their characteristics? What should we see how they walk, how they sit, how they stand, or are there other signs? So Krishna never answers any of those three questions. He begins like this, 255. When he wholly discards all the desires of his heart, and he is happy in his self alone. Atmani eva atmana tushtaha. He's satisfied in himself, by himself. He has no more desires for anything. Why is that? Sarvan Kaman. All desires he's freed from. If we try to control our desires, we won't be free from them. They'll be lurking there. You're just sitting on a spring, they come back. The only way to get freed from all desires is to know the self, which never had any desires. When it says sarvan, all desires, it doesn't mean most, it doesn't mean 90. Having cast off all desires through the knowledge of the self, he's happy in the self alone. He's content in his own self. Atmani eva atmana tushtaha. When that is the case, stitta prajna uchite. That person is said to be stitta prajna, established in the wisdom of the self. That silent sage is said to have stable wisdom when sufferings no longer perturb his mind.
Mhm.
The question is, does he even have a mind? What do we attribute to him that he has a mind? But from his point of view, he has no desires because he has no mind. But from our point of view, he has no desire. There is, when sufferings no longer perturb his mind, when he ceases to cling to pleasures, and he is rid of attachment, fear, and anger, because he's taken his stand in the self. Only the wise man can do this. The one who's trying to restrain their anger, control their senses. You can improve, but you'll never get rid of it that way. His wisdom is stable, who clings to nothing, good or evil. The spiritual sadhaka tries to cling to the good and avoid the evil. But the one established in the self, he has no interest in good or evil, dharma and adharma, righteousness or unrighteousness. He neither seeks nor shuns them. When he wholly withdraws the senses, when he wholly withdraws his senses, does this person have senses?
Mhm.
Or does it look from our point of view that he has senses and a mind and a body? And from that point of view, when he wholly withdraws his senses from their objects, just as a tortoise, when a tortoise is in fear, it withdraws its limbs and it's in its own self. These senses that are naturally outward going, but when these senses are out, that wisdom can't be stable. He's withdrawn his senses like a tortoise on all sides. Then his wisdom is said to be stable. Objects, but not the taste, 59. Objects, but not the taste for them, fall off for the man who does not feed on them. But when he intuits the supreme reality, even this taste goes. In other words, you can go into a cave and try to withdraw the senses, but in that cave, the mind will be there filled with desires. So even though you withdraw the senses, the organs of action, the taste for them won't go. But having seen this truth, even the taste goes. That supreme attainment of bliss, ananda prapti, he's attained the supreme bliss. The mind goes towards that naturally. He has no taste. But the person who's restraining the senses, he doesn't lose the taste for them. That yogi who's trying to not be under the under the control of the roving senses. He has to withdraw them. But this person, the senses don't affect him at all. He doesn't even have the taste for them. Arjuna, the impetuous senses, even of a learned man, the person who studied the scripture and has been taught, you are the self, unborn, unchanging, or pervading. If that person, his senses are impetuous, that means extrovert, those senses, they carry away his wisdom. We've heard this teaching 100 times, but as soon as the senses are out, it sees an object that it considers desirable, and then we perform actions to go towards that. The impetuous senses, they carry away his wisdom, and they get him in trouble. The thing that we think is going to make us happy, we find out later that it was a source of suffering. But when we were going after it, we thought it was very desirable. It's only the wise man who knows that those things were going to get me in trouble. So anyway, these senses, they take away this knowledge. They forcibly drive the mind astray. Tani sarvani samyamya yukta sita matparaha. So, if you want to have stable knowledge, Arjuna, you must bring those roving senses under your control. Stable is his wisdom, who has brought his senses under control. And then there's a beautiful part in the Gita about how desires arise and how they get us into trouble. So let me explain. This is a psychological type of examination. It says, by thinking about the objects, by dhyayan vishayan, by thinking about the objects, a person becomes attached to them. The more we think about it, how desirable it is, how wonderful it would be to have, that attachment to that thing grows. So from just thinking about the objects, we get attached to them. From that attachment, we get the desire to enjoy that object. So from attachment comes desire. From desire comes anger. How does that happen? I want the thing. If anything gets in between me and the object of my desire, any obstruction, that thing I get angry at. Whenever I'm angry, it's because some desire that I wanted was not fulfilled. That thing becomes an object of anger. We get angry because our desires are not being fulfilled due to some reason. That reason we get angry at. It's because of desire that we become angry. So, from thinking of the objects, we get attached. From the attachment comes desire. From desire, the possibility of anger. From anger, 63, from anger, when I'm angry, when you're angry, when anyone is angry, there's no Vedanta. At that point, I am anger. My blood, I'm turning red. I want that. At that time, because we're so identified with the I am angry, from that, the delusion that I am angry at that person, that's called moha. Because the self is ever peaceful. It never has any anger. Anger is a quality of the mind. The self is pure consciousness forever and always. But as soon as I'm angry, I'm totally angry. There's no Vedanta, there's no teacher, there's no nothing. From anger comes delusion. From delusion means total identification with the anger. I forget the whole teaching about the self. Smriti Brahmaha. I was taught that the self is unborn, ever peaceful, ever blissful. That's my eternal nature. But now that I'm caught up in anger, I've forgotten that whole teaching. Because I've forgotten that teaching, all my discrimination goes. Buddhi vinasha. That discrimination about who is the self, what is the not self. So this is the progression. You think about the objects, you become attached to them, you get desire for them, you get angry when something obstructs that desire. When you're angry, you can't remember the teaching. When you can't remember the teaching, there's no discrimination. And when there's no discrimination, you are identified with this body, and therefore you get destroyed. Total destruction ensues. When there's no discrimination between yourself and the body, which happens when you forget the teaching, which happens when you're identified with anger, which happens because some desire was obstructed, which came from attachment to that object, which came from merely thinking about the object. So this is the whole, we call it, the steps by which the whole Vedantic teaching goes out the window. It's a reminder to us we should not be attached to the objects, but get the mind attached to the self, because this is what happens. Approaching the objects with the senses free from attachment and aversion. It's not saying you shouldn't engage the senses in the subjects. It's the inner attachment and aversion, raga dvesha, the likes and dislikes that are the problem. Free from that attachment and aversion and controlled by the mind. The senses are going, but the mind has them well restrained. That person, that man who has mastered his mind, he wins serenity. Serenity won, sufferings come to an end. The reason of that man whose mind is serene soon becomes established in wisdom. When the mind is quiet and introvert and sattvic, that mind becomes a sthita prajna, established in that correct knowledge about the self. The unintegrated mind, who has no wisdom, nor can such a person even have a yearning for self-knowledge. Without such yearning, there is no peace. And for one who has no peace, how can there be happiness? The mind that conforms to the roving senses robs him of his wisdom about the self. The mind that follows the roving senses robs him of the wisdom of the self. Just as the wind sweeps the boat off its course on the sea. When the boat, the sail is up, when the wind blows this way, it's blown that way, blown this way. It's because it hasn't withdrawn. Those senses are out and it's getting blown in all directions. Therefore, his wisdom is stable, whose senses have been withdrawn on all sides from their objects. In order to see the self, the mind must become introvert. In order to have stable wisdom, there has to be a subtlety of mind that can discriminate. If it's filled with anger and desire and greed, then this is what the Gita is saying. There could be no, you've heard the teaching. Why can't I be established in this wisdom? This is the reason. The senses and the mind are running out and they're robbing his wisdom like a boat on the sea, the wind taking it off course. But for the restrained ascetic, he is awake to what is night to all living beings. All living beings have no idea about the self. In the dream, all of those people, they have no idea that there's a witness of that dream. To them, it's night. What's night to all living beings is day to the sage. And what's day to the sage is the night to all living beings. To that sage who is awakened, what is night for all living beings, while when these latter are awake, what they take to be awake is nothing but darkness to him. Almost finished. He wins peace, into whose mind these objects of desire. He's no longer trying to restrain the desires. They enter the mind like rivers enter into an ocean that is stable. The rivers don't bring the ocean up. They're going out, don't bring it down. Like a stable ocean, those desires enter into him, but even so, they have no effect on his nature. He wins peace, into whose mind the objects of desires enter as water flows into a full and stable sea that is being filled, and not he who yearns after the objects of desire. The person who yearns after the objects of desire is caught in the karma and the bondage of karma. But for the wise man, whom desires enter and doesn't affect him at all, like a stable sea, he gets peace, and not for the one who yearns after the objects of desire. That man who, giving up all objects of desire, moves about, seeking nothing. He's content in himself. He's happy in himself. He feels that he's attained the highest goal of human life. There's nothing more for him to do or to attain. For that person, giving up all objects of desire, like a snake on a rope, he moves about. He doesn't even move about. People see him moving about. He is the unmoving self, and people see him move about. But that person who's moving about is not seeking anything. He doesn't want your money. He doesn't want to abuse you, take advantage of you. He has no desire for anything from you. He seeks nothing, moving about, seeking nothing, and rid of all sense of me and mine, of I and me. This idea that I do, that I know, that I enjoy. I am this. And once I am this, automatically, just like in the dream, as soon as there's the I, there's the mine, my world, my friends, my house, my money, my, I and mine. But the witness, which is the witness of I and mine, the true self, that person who's taken his stand in that self, is free from I and mine, which is the whole samsara. I am this means I was born, getting old, sick, and dying. I was awake, I had a dream, I slept. Those misconceptions are gone. This person, he has nothing to do. He's rid of all sense of I and mine, and he wins peace. The idea that the ego is going to win peace is a misconception. The ego can never win peace. The person who's free from I and mine, he wins peace. The I that says, I want peace, is not the self. He can never win peace. But the one who sees the self free from I and mine, he wins serenity. This state is the status of Brahman. The last verse, 72. This state of that person, he takes his stand in that absolute reality. Esha Brahmi Sthiti. This is the establishment in Brahman. O Arjuna, nahinam prapya vimuyati. After attaining this state, he can never become deluded again. Why is that? Because unlike worldly knowledge, where I remain the knower and I have a mind and I know something, I can be deluded again, even if I know it. But here, the wise man has no mind. It's the mind that can be deluded, not the self. He can never become deluded again, having attained this state of the true nature of the self, pure consciousness.
Mm.
This is the status of Brahman, Arjuna. Attaining it, none gets deluded. Abiding in it, even at the last hour of death. What that means is, if you realize it right now, or in a day from now, or on your dying last breath, the moment you realize it, you'll be free. When even at the last moment, this knowledge will liberate you. Even at the last hour of death, one gains brahman nirvana, the nirvana not of the Buddhists, the nirvana of Brahman, the self of everyone. That's what he'll win, even at the last moment. If the mind turns to that and realizes I am that, they attain Brahman nirvana. The nirvana. Nirvana means without any wind. Nirvana. It's blown out. All duality has been washed out, and only Brahman remains. That's called Brahman nirvana. Brahman nirvana, richiti. He attains that Brahman nirvana, richiti. He goes to that, his true nature. That is the person who's called the Sthitta Prajna. So I'm going to end it with that. That's the complete second chapter. And the third chapter begins with the true teaching. He just gave him an introduction. So the third chapter is going to begin with a question. Hey, if this is the real deal, this wisdom that frees you, why are you telling me to get into this war business? What is this? You're confusing me. And then Krishna explains why he's telling Arjuna to fight. Even though the Sthitta Prajna is the one who's withdrawn all his senses and has taken his stand in the self. Why is he telling Arjuna to fight? That's the beginning of the next chapter. So why don't we do just 5 minutes or something? If anybody has any comments or questions so far, you can unmute yourself. Feel free. Okay, I guess I was...
Well, it's just so mind-blowing, mind-boggling, that after going through the whole thing of losing your senses, losing your mind, losing your intellect and your ego, that you're now going back to, now you have to act. So it's the juxtaposition of those two are just overwhelming.
The knowledge of the self is one thing. If you know that, you can't do karma yoga because you realize I do nothing. And then the other teaching of you are an agent, and I'm going to teach you how to act in the world in a certain way so that you'll be freed from action. These two teachings have to be understood properly. In the beginning of the fourth chapter, Krishna says, Jnana yogina samkhyanam karma yogina yoginam. For the people that understand this, they can't do karma yoga. They have to abide in the self as their only yoga. But for the people that are not up to that, they can't give up their identification with the idea that I'm a doer. That, to that person, this karma yoga teaching is being addressed. In order to understand clearly what are the two teachings being given here is not easy to do. And many people have been confused about the whole thing. and therefore I'm hoping that I can lay it out in the correct way.
Good.
Way that's different than there are 4 separate paths and they all lead to the same goal.
I have a question.
Please.
All right. It sounds like what you're talking about is the free will illusion a little bit. Realizing you don't have free will. Aren't you kind of coming to the same conclusion there with that? And I have a second thing I wanted to bring up. I read fellow Woodstock resident's book, Bob Berman's Beyond Biocentrism.
Yes.
And I felt that what was in the book was pointing towards Advaita Vedanta, and that's why the teachings are very believable to me. Otherwise, with the Western mind, I would have said, this is nonsense, and not gave it a half a second. But I think you're both pointing at the same things.
Well, let me say a few things. Bob Berman is a student of Advaita Vedanta, and this whatever he calls
Centrism.
it, centrism, that consciousness is a fundamental thing in the universe. He's mixed it up with this business. But this is a modern trend that quantum mechanics shows that consciousness is fundamental and all of it. Has nothing to do with what we're talking here. But it is true, Bob Berman appreciates Advaita, and he tries to work it in with science in his own way. The other thing is the idea that I'm a doer, that I have free will, can only be possible if I have a body, mind, and senses. Then naturally we feel that I am a doer. That illusion is common to everyone. We all feel that I'm the doer. Vedanta accepts that, okay, in the illusion, you're a doer, and I'm going to teach you how to do your duty in a particular way. But the truth of it is, you are not a doer. You have no free will. You have no will. You are the unchanging consciousness that is beyond determinism or free will, beyond cause and effect, beyond time and space. In the illusion, it looks like you're an agent. We all feel like I'm an agent. So from that point of view, Vedanta says, yes, you're an agent, but do your actions in a particular way. So just as a starting point, but in the end, it's going to teach, Arjuna is going to learn that the person who thinks he's an agent, he knows not the truth. He's a deluded, I do. He says, ahamkara vimudatma. He's deluded by this ego, thinking that I am the doer. But in fact, he's the unchanging witness that never does anything. This will come out more as we continue to show that what I'm saying here is, this is what the Bhagavad Gita is teaching. So that's the best I think I can say about that.
Okay.
Anyone? Other question? Okay, let me end the class.
Yes.
Additional thing, and I'm going to go through the 3rd chapter and finish it at least next class, maybe 3 and 4. So if you read it, anyone who wants to be prepared for it, they can read ahead at least once, and then when I discuss it, you'll be familiar with it. So, Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
See you next week, Ira.
Good.